you talked about being an alien and being a stranger, and you said don't be an alien and don't be a stranger, but I think part of what makes sociology and anthropology interesting is that you get to be a stranger and an alien. And in a sense, even in the world that's familiar to you, you become a stranger and an alien when you start to see it as a sociologist or as an anthropologist. But in the process of engaging in research, we are constantly engaged in a process of crossing borders and getting messy, getting dirty. And one of the things I want to talk about today is how I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to tell some stories. This is going to be not a lot of heavy theory. I'm going to have some concepts that are embedded in this presentation. There's going to be a lot of pictures and a lot of stories, some video, right? You all like video, it's morning. So to hear some voices from Detroit and from other places, but in these stories and on this sort of journey that I want to take you on, I want to encourage you to cross borders, to be uncomfortable, to get messy, to get dirty, because there's a real value that comes out of that, something that emerges from that process that can't be anticipated in the beginning. And this goes against many of the things we learn when we're trying to be scientists, quote unquote, young scientists. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. So I know this is a bit of a busy slide. I was putting this presentation together last night, and I seem to be constitutionally unable to have a slide with only text on it. So I can't leave a slide alone until I put like some visuals or images on there. Sometimes I put a few. So I also added in the word rivers because the original title of this presentation was Lessons from Alleys and Cabbage Fields. And I was like, well, the rivers are also really important here too. So I added in rivers. And there's a quote at the top here, since this slide has been up for a little while. You may have had a chance to read it already. It's by Matthew Gandy, who is a geographer, a British geographer, who a really brilliant scholar, and really actually very nice gentleman as well, because I've gotten a chance to know Matthew over a number of years. And he has a recent book called Natura Urbana, which refers to urban nature. And he's really talking about this kind of complex interrelationship between human beings, environments, urban environments, and nature. And I pulled this quote out of it because it seemed to be really relevant for a lot of things that I'm working on and I'm talking about today, where he says, the intrinsic worth of the ostensibly useless is as much a political question as an aesthetic or a scientific one. And what he's talking about here are areas of cities that have nature in them. Oh, getting ahead of ourselves, but you can look at that. Areas that have nature in them, but which are not understood as having value, right? So if you think about vacant lots or back lots or overgrown patches of ground, right? In some cities which have had damage or have had abandonment over time, you have these spaces will fill in with plants and animals, and sometimes people don't know what to make of these because again they're messy spaces, right? And so part of what he's interested in is what emerges around these kinds of messy spaces where actually nature is creating its own order, and it's human beings that have to figure out how to relate to it. And so this question of places that have become devalued or have been seen as useless from one perspective, what do they mean and what's their significance from other perspectives, is a big part of the projects I'm going to talk about today, because all of these spaces that are referenced, these rivers, alleys, and cabbage fields are all spaces that have been or were at one point devalued, seen as being sort of off the map, not really worth anything, right? Kind of in between marginal spaces. And of course the people associated with them were also seen as being marginal people in many cases. So these are some of the very important theoretical concepts that I want to convey. I like to think and work in terms of metaphors. I actually do have some theoretical concepts in here as well, but I'm just going to say a couple words about ponds, soup, and stickiness. And those of you who were at my presentation yesterday will have heard this already, so I'm going to do it fairly quickly. But I'm happy to see some familiar faces here today, but also some new faces. So ponds. I have a colleague who's a biologist. I like to work with people from all different fields and have conversations with them to understand how they think about different about the environments in particular, the environments that I'm interested in. So because I'm interested in these sort of in-between spaces and these kind of wild spaces or these overgrown spaces, I'm always interested in talking to biologists and ecologists. And we were having this conversation, he was talking about, well, part of the problem with ecology is that from a scientific standpoint, it's kind of self-limiting, because if you think about a pond, and you're a pond scientist, and you do the most intensive, in-depth study of a pond, of a single pond, to understand everything about that pond, you may understand and describe everything about that pond, but that would be actually functionally useless for somebody else, because every pond is different. Every pond is unique into itself, right? And so the deeper you go into one thing and understanding what makes it unique, kind of the farther you go away from some of our scientific goals, which is what? For our findings to be generalizable and transferable, right? So this idea that something is unique, that a case study, for example, is unique and distinctive unto itself, is really intrinsically interesting to us, and it should be, that's what I'm arguing. But when you go to publish on it, you're going to face this possible criticism that, well, this is an interesting case, but what does it have to say about anything else? Because you're really just talking about this one case, right? And then when you're talking about a whole collection of variables like this that are all mixed in together, and of course the goal of scientists and social scientists is often to understand, like, what are the important independent variables and what are the important dependent variables and what's driving what. And we have all sorts of ways of trying to figure out, like, what are the most important factors contributing to this outcome, right? Because that's kind of the scientific purpose, is to cut away everything that's not important, that's a confounding variable, right? And to isolate the key variables that are making something happen. And when you put in too many other confounding variables and you say, well, oh, yeah, but you have, sure, we can come up with a measure of collective efficacy or something like that, but what's really happening in this community is that you have these particular leaders, and they learned at this particular point in time about this particular government program, and then they met these other people at a church, and then they had a meal, and it's all these contingent, random things contributed to this overall outcome. And from a scientific standpoint, that's like, well, that's just a soup. That's just a soup of variables. That doesn't help us. When you go to get funding at a federal level, because believe me, I've tried to do this. This is kind of what they'll say. They'll say, well, they can appreciate a soup. They'll say, but that's not, we can't evaluate that as science because it's too much of a soup, right? Well, what I realized at some point is that I like soup, right? And I like, just like I like ponds. And I like every soup because of what's distinctive about it, what makes it different from any other soup, right? And so there has to be a value and appreciation for what makes each site, each community, each case unique and distinctive, while at the same time, as scientists, we're trying to draw lessons, right, that can be applied to other places, and to be able to balance those two things. So I think that's a really important challenge, and I think it's really important to keep the value of the messiness in our minds. And then the final point has to do with this idea of stickiness, which is related to these two ideas as well, because again, stickiness, when you're talking about science, social science, and natural science, is kind of a problem, right? Because you're trying to create a sort of a clean explanation, again, with the confounding variables stripped away and only the really important variables identified. But the fact is that real-life situations are often very sticky, and especially when you're engaged in relationships with people, as we are as social scientists, right? Because how can you be like an objective observer? And I think most of us in anthropology and sociology have stopped necessarily trying to be like the objective scientist who's just like the eye on the wall, observing but not becoming enmeshed in the situation that we're involved with, that we're studying. Because as human beings, we're a part of this situation that we're studying, right? And these situations these relationships are sticky, right? And so the Germans have a term which they call, in German, Fingerspitzengefühl, which means fingertip feel. And so what I'm sort of arguing is that the upside, the downside of stickiness is that, first of all, it's not efficient. right? When you're engaged in a lot of relationships, especially you're trying to do research, and then you become involved in different projects, and then, you know, you had in mind when you started you were going to study this one thing, but then you meet these other people, and then they start working on this other thing, and then they say, well, why don't you become a part of this project? You don't just study this project, you can become a part of this project. Why don't you come to our community meeting? Why don't you come have dinner with us? Why don't you come to this demonstration? Why don't you come help work in this lot? You know, and then pretty soon you're a part of your stuff, right? And of course that makes things slower. But it also gives you this sense of what the Germans call fingertip feel over time, is that you get a very nuanced sense of what are all the contingent variables in the situation, right? Who are the players? What's the nature of the environment? How is the environment affecting what's happening, and how do people relate to the environment and to each other? So, I'm arguing all these things are actually really, really valuable. So now I'm going to give some recognized social science concepts that I'm going to reference later, but I'm going to put them up now so you can. Collective efficacy, collective effervescence, and civil society. I did a little search on Google with collective efficacy and collective effervescence together. How many of you are familiar with each of these concepts? Have you heard of collective effervescence? Well, this is a great concept. This comes from Emil Durkheim. It's an old concept. I'll define it later on. Collective efficacy is kind of a more recent concept that has to do with the ability of communities to do things together. But I looked it up and I found out I can't find any papers that talk about these two things together. So, of course, as a social scientist, and you say, well, this is an opportunity now. I can write a paper about collective efficacy and collective effervescence together and do something new, right? But that wasn't my goal when I started this, but maybe where I ended up. So these are three of the concepts that I'm going to reference later on in the presentation. I wanted to say one other thing. This relates to the idea about stickiness and about ponds and soup. When we think about areas, when we think about territories, when we think about geography, again, in our kind of Western scientific mindset, we tend to think in terms of abstracts and absolutes and universals, right? And we can think about this as, you know, sort of the rational map that we're all familiar with. Like if you go on Google Maps or if you look on a printed map. We've basically come to understand that, you know, that the geography, physical world is a kind of an objective phenomenon. And if this is Australia, it should always look like this, right? And have certain dimensions to it that are sort of objectively measurable. This is also Australia, right? Do you recognize what's happening here? Probably not, because this is a diagram of a song line, right? This is a diagram of space and time that makes sense to Aboriginal people, right? Because it maps out an environment in terms of where things are related, where things exist in relationship to other things. But Aboriginal maps can only be properly read or understood by the initiated, since some of the information they contain is secret, right? The secrecy concerns the ways in which the map is linked to the whole body of knowledge that constitutes Aboriginal culture. This was, to me, was a very important idea I was exposed to in my PhD program, the idea of maps versus territories. And in a certain sense, to learn a territory, you have to go off the map. Because the map, which we think of as being, again, a kind of an objective diagram of space, really only communicates so much. It doesn't tell you what's going on inside of that space. It doesn't tell you about that place. And that place is where all these relationships exist. And where different people relate to the same things in very, very different ways. In terms of objects in the environment, or buildings, or trees, right? Or streets, or roads, or alleys, or rivers. And so part of this process is also about thinking about the relationship between the map that we're trying to build as scientists, or that we're supposed to build, in which everything can be sort of objectively related to everything else. Like, where does your paper about this topic fit in relationship to the established body of literature and so on, right? But also about really trying to understand what makes a particular place what it is. and to represent that truly and accurately and authentically, and with respect to the people for whom that place is not just a place to be studied, a space to be studied, but is a meaningful place or a home, right? Or a neighborhood, a community. Okay. So that's kind of some of the foundational ideas or concepts. Now I'm going to get into sort of telling more sort of personal and environmental stories. So the first story I'm going to tell is about a river in Detroit called the Rouge River. There are several rivers that come together in the city of Detroit, Michigan, which sits on the border between the United States and Canada. Detroit, Michigan is actually north of Canada, if you can picture that, because it sits on the bend of the Detroit River, and below the river is the country of Canada, right? But there are other rivers that flow into the Detroit River, and one of them is this river called the Rouge River, which historically was used by native indigenous people as, you know, a place to, as a campground, as a place to clean deer skins, you know, trapping, you know, hunting, all kinds of different purposes. And then the European colonists came in, and of course they turned it into their own purposes. First they were trapping beaver, and then they trapped all the beaver, so there were no more beaver left. There are beaver now coming back, actually, to the Rouge River. And then they made farms there. You know, Europeans did this. They put farms along the river, and then the age of industry came, and so this river became very, very industrialized. And actually, Henry Ford, who was one of the people responsible for the development of the automobile industry, who lived in the town where I live now, which is Dearborn, Michigan, actually got the U.S. government to help him reroute this river to make it straighter and deeper so he could get huge freighters up and down the river to supply his factory in Dearborn, right? So this is a river which has been greatly altered by human beings over a period of several centuries, and also very much polluted as a result of the industry along the river. And as a result, this river, the Rouge River, has been seen as a devalued place, right? A place that, especially in Detroit, where it's seen as being a polluted area. A place where why would you ever want to go, you would never want to swim in this river because you might end up sick or with a mutation, you know. Your skin might, fall off, or something terrible might happen to you, or why would you ever go canoeing or kayaking on this river, right? But I started meeting people that were very involved in this river. They loved this river, and their sort of purpose was to kind of reconnect people to this river, to restore and recover this river and make it into the really valuable human and environmental asset that it historically has been and it ought to be, right? So I started working with some of these people on a project to create a park along this very industrialized section of the Rouge River. And so this is a picture from a story that was done in 2014. You can see the headline, "Where Industry and Ecology Collide, the Future of the Rouge River." And this is a headline from Bloomberg City Lab from 2020. So that's 6 years of difference there. This is when we were about 2 years into this discussion about this project, which at the time seemed like very much a dream. Why would you ever put a park for people to go and enjoy nature in this very, very industrialized, polluted area? Who would ever go to a park like this, right? But through my involvement with other people who had this belief in the potential of the river and the potential of nature to regenerate itself, I became involved in this process of trying to create this park. And so this was one of our early renderings of the park and what it would look like. See, it says Fort Street Bridge Park coming in summer of 2016. There's another big piece of the story which you'll learn about in a minute, which has to do with the labor history of Michigan, which is related to this site. So we had this rendering, and you see it says coming in 2016. Well, the park didn't come in 2016. It actually didn't come until 2020. For a long time, all we had was this rendering and this video. Do you want to see this video? Okay. And this video was put together by a dedicated intern at the time, a student who was working at an engineering firm who had a real interest in this project. Well, we got a lot of mileage out of this video.
Part of southwest Detroit's heaviest industrialized area, commemorating historical events along the lower Rouge River and enhancing life-giving green infrastructure. Marathon Petroleum Company LP undertook a transformation of the deteriorating 100-acre Oakwood Heights neighborhood and is working toward creating a multifunctional green space replenished by urban agriculture, native forest, prairie, and wetland. Envision the new 4th Street Bridge as an urban gateway, providing safe bicycle travel over the Rouge River to downriver communities, while connecting the Iron Belt Trail, a statewide trail system. The site plan includes a variety of interpretive, recreational, and environmental enhancements. When entering at the corner of Oakwood and Denmark Streets, visitors are greeted with a seat wall and bicycle parking loops. A small gathering plaza is bordered by 2 more seat walls cast in concrete to imitate the stylized pattern of industrial machinery. Salvaged piers from the deconstructed bridge can be repurposed as the plaza's sculpture piece. In 1932, the bridge accommodated the Ford Hunger March, where 3,000 workers marched for better working conditions. A conflict with the police arose, 5 people were killed and over 60 others were injured. Interpretive signage constructed from the former bridge's steel support beams helped tell the story of the historic 4th Street Bridge. The plaza opens into a demonstration area, describing the importance of stormwater management. Water from interactive fountains simulates the urban and natural water cycle, while offering visitors an opportunity to get wet on hot days. A series of rain gardens filter stormwater before reaching the Rouge River. The elements previously described are part of the first phase of construction. A future phase is planned to the north. A boardwalk runs from the plaza area along the Rouge riverfront and leads into a universally accessible kayak launch. Kayaking on the Rouge River is an urban waterway adventure, giving an exciting new perspective of historical and significant features along the river, such as gigantic industrial complexes and Great Lakes freighters. Restoration of the Rouge River is progressing and contributing to increased wildlife populations and the prospect of natural sightseeing. Riverbank habitat enhancements include native aquatic plants that provide an opportunity for fish spawning and nursery. Phase 1 development is anticipated to be completed in the summer of 2016, contingent on donations. The Frog Vision exemplifies concepts of enhanced blue and green infrastructure embraced by the Detroit Future City Framework and the balanced economic, environmental, and cultural approach of the Rouge Gateway Partnership.
Okay, so we had this sign, right? You like that video? 3 minutes, right? There's a lot stuffed into 3 minutes. We used to say, well, that's a lot of potatoes to put in one sack. You know, but, so we would show this video every chance we get. We talk, well, we had this idea to build this park. This sign sat here. This was what, before the park was built, it was just this, it had been a bar there. There had been a bar there for years, and the bar was torn down to make way for the construction of the new bridge, which became the kind of the leverage point for us to argue for building a park next to this new bridge. Because this historical event had happened there, the Ford Hunger March. We wanted to commemorate this event. So we had all these different partners. We had people from the labor movement, the United Auto Workers. We had people from the National Park Service, people from the environmental movement, people from different cities, you know, City of Detroit, City of Dearborn. And we had this oil company, Marathon Petroleum Company. So this very diverse group of partners, and this whole project became a process for me of just not only trying to move towards this goal, but also becoming enmeshed in more and more relationships and more things. So we had this sign here, I think, for about 4 years, and people kept saying, well, when is this park ever going to be built? We don't think you're ever going to do this. And we did all these events to raise money. We did little concerts, right, to raise money, fundraisers and stuff. People were like, well, we keep coming to these concerts, but that sign is still there and the park hasn't been built, so are you really, you know, are you keeping all the money, or what's going on? Eventually, we did succeed in building the park, and this is what it looked like when everything was built and the park was planted. This is when the landscape was fairly new before it came into bloom. This was our ribbon cutting ceremony, which took place in the fall of 2020. So what was going on in fall of 2020? You can see here. See how everybody's spaced, right? That's because this was still in the middle of the pandemic, right? So we had some of our local legislators, congressional representatives, and our elected leaders from the city of Detroit and other places were there to cut the ribbon. And that's me there with my U of M mask on, right? And so eventually we achieve this goal. But then, of course, like many other things, this is just a little video clip about the ribbon cutting. I think we can skip that.
Part of Detroit's history has been honored with the opening of a brand new park. Today was the grand opening for the new Fort Street Bridge Interpretive Park. The park pays tribute to the old Fort Street Bridge, which was used during the Fort Hunger March protest in 1932. The march served as a big push to create the United Auto Workers Union. The Fort Rouge Gateway Coalition helped create the park. It's currently, it includes a sculpture, rain garden, and walking path. There are also plans to include a boardwalk and kayak launch in the future.
So yeah, in the future. So the future, of course, is now, because time doesn't stop. And so now we're working on phase 2 of the park. So this area that you can see, this area here is going to be part of phase 2 of the park. You can see people already use it very actively as a fishing spot. And so, again, being a part of this project has involved, not only trying to achieve certain goals, but then getting involved in other goals and other relationships. So we've had to, after you build a park, you have to keep a park clean. You have to maintain a park. So that involves, developing, getting volunteers involved, and then building relationships with the people who use the park and say, hey, we have a trash can over here. You can put your trash in there. You don't have to throw it on the ground, right? But also the natural environment is a big part of this picture too, because every time you're out working in a site like this, you're seeing the signs of active nature and natural systems all around you. So you can, in the United States, people like big cars. This is called a Hummer. Have you ever seen a Hummer before? I don't know if anyone has a Hummer in Lithuania. Probably very rare, right? But there, people park next to the river and fishing. And of course, this vision of children being able to cool off on hot days is now very much a reality. So people use the park, and we have these little frog-shaped fountains. Because the name of our group, which is the Fort Rouge Gateway Partnership, we turned that into the abbreviation FROG. So some people, we just call it the Frog Park. So we had to put these little frogs in there that spray water. And we also use this now as a site of active learning for classes and for students, where they can come, you can bring a group of students, and there's historical interpretive signage where people can learn about the story of this landscape and what happened here in the past and why, what this sculpture represents. This sculpture is made from old pieces of the old Fort Street Bridge, where the Hunger March took place. And then we do events there. And this is, a friend of mine who's also a labor lawyer and a musician.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Tony Paris. I'm here with some friends of mine. Pretty much, we're here gathered today at the Fort Street Bridge Park on the 89th anniversary of the day of when the Hunger Marchers gathered at this site to go over the bridge and to present a list of demands to Henry Ford. They were met with violence, and workers lost their lives. It was the beginning of what many of us believe.
And then he goes on and sings a song. Oh, we did a little homage to Bob Dylan. You guys like Bob Dylan?
We are the ones who dig a grave, we are freezing. Digging in the mines all the time. It's cold and getting dark, so you might have a spark to stay warm and find life.
So, the park becomes now a site of ongoing activity and more relationships, right? So, I was talking about Earth Day before the presentation started. Earth Day is this week, right? Actually, it's tomorrow in the U.S., right? And so we have a cleanup there every year, and this is from last year's cleanup. I won't be there this year, but I have friends and colleagues and associates that are going to be there on the site. And this is all trash that people pulled off the site, off the riverbanks to help clean the environment and keep the environment clean. So this is all really foreground to my coming here to Kaunas and my connection to the Shanxi community, which is also surrounded by a river here in Kaunas, an anonymous river. And I was here, and the last time I was here was in 2016. My colleague, Yorate Imbrasite, who's not here today, this is a photograph she took of me at this place called the Cabbage Field, located in Shanxi, which is this sort of working class neighborhood surrounded by a river. I didn't know anything about until I attended this, actually, I think this conference, and we had a student who was talking about their work in the Shanxi community. I was like, I really want to go see this place, right? So they took me to see the cabbage field, and I had a lot of interest in what was happening in this neighborhood. And then during the pandemic, I was contacted by Urate and one of the neighborhood residents in Shanxi, and they said, well, we heard you're an academic in the United States, and you had an interest in the river, and urban rivers, and you had interest in our neighborhood, so we want to tell you about this problem we're having with our city government, where they're trying to build a road next to the river, right? And in building this road, they're actually going to be removing a lot of this green space and natural area that we really like. People who live in this community really like. So they said, well, we're soliciting letters, of support for our discussions with the city, our protests and our resistance to this effort to build this road. So I put a letter together, and this is just an excerpt from it, where I talked about, visiting Shanxi about a year ago, and I heard about the plans to conduct the transport road in this area, to pave over some of this green space, which I had seen while I was there, and I had really recognized how this kind of it was this sort of green space that is undefined, right? And when people don't recognize that this is a park or like this is a golf course, they can devalue it. And they say, well, this is just waste space. It's just space that's sitting here. We could have a road here, we could have apartments here, we could have a shopping center here. But all of that is not seeing the value that it has in terms of what it is, and also the relationships that people have with it, right? So I used a quote from American Western artist Charlie Russell, who once said, roads never made a town any better, they just made it easier for cars to travel, right? And so we start thinking about roads. Roads are something that cities become obsessed with building roads because people want to be able to drive their cars faster from place to place. But if you look at what roads actually produce in the long run, part of our experience in the United States was building roads everywhere, next to rivers and putting factories next to rivers like we saw at the Rouge River. What we're seeing now in the United States is that people are trying to reconnect with their rivers. So we're actually in the process of trying to tear these roads out and to move these factories, close these factories and put parks and walking trails. And Detroit, which used to be all industrial all along its waterfront, now has a Detroit River Walk, which stretches for about 10 miles. And is now seen as one of the most successful river walks in the entire country, and people love it, right? So what I said in this letter was, why don't you save some time, instead of building a road and then 20 years from now wanting to tear it out because people want to reconnect with the river and reestablish a natural riverbank. You have a natural riverbank, keep the natural riverbank, right? Started organizing these protests about this road project, right? And you can see this is from their website. It says, after the Conus municipality announced a new street was planned to be built, residents of this part of the city stated that they would rather enjoy the green areas than the asphalt sausage, I like that terminology, and started a campaign against the car road, right? So this campaign took on a lot of very creative forms. They created this plastic sheet which showed how much space this road would take up along the river, right? And if you actually built a road all through here, it would take out all of this space that's currently there and turn it into, asphalt and parking, because this is just the driving road, then you have to have the parking spots next to it. And so this is that plastic sheeting that they use. They use these very creative ways to show why it was important that this place not be turned into a road, and also to suggest some alternative uses for it. And this also led to a kind of a community spirit related to the Cabbage Field Project. The Cabbage Field Project, again, has started out as this kind of reclaiming of this piece of heritage area, which was part of the old fortress system in Conus, but had long been kind of abandoned. People weren't really using it. There was trash there and things like that. And the residents started using this space for different types of activities, for cultural activities. They were doing cleanups there. And then they started looking into the story of the cabbage field and the history of it. And out of this history and out of this community spirit that had come out of this road resistance, they created an opera. They actually wrote a community opera, which was written, the music was all composed by a local resident, and all the parts, with the exception of a few, were played by local people. The singing parts, the chorus parts. And when I came here in January, they were in the midst of rehearsals for a performance in Rotterdam, which took place in April. I got to be a part of these rehearsals. I actually got to be a part of the chorus there, you see. So this was held at the church on Josipavicic Street, Prospectus in Shanxi. So I got to become a part of this community, right? Which also led to me attending some of their community meetings at the Shanxi Library and at the city of Kaunas, where they were contesting, again, some of the decisions by Kaunas municipality about cutting of trees in Ąžuolynas Park, which is the oak park in the Shanxi community. And here you see, it says a map drawn by one of the residents of Shanxi, who's a retired architect. This is this distinctive shape of the Shanxi community, which is surrounded, as you see, by river on all sides. So being a part of this process, I was also invited to be part of something else that grew out of this cabbage field and this protest against the park, and the protest against the road, I should say. And this was this project called Genius Loci, which means, spirit of place, right? And this was a partnership with KTU, the other university, or one of the other universities here in Kaunas, where neighborhood residents were really the driving force here, and they were expressing what their ideas were for what this neighborhood could be, putting on a map all the places in the neighborhood that were valuable to them, right? This is one example of a natural habitat within the neighborhood that a resident put on the map and explained why it was important to them, why this was a unique place in Kaunas and should be preserved. I got to be a part of this process as well. As you can see, they were doing engagements at KTU with students from Shanxi communities, students in elementary school, gymnasium students. And the students were actually asked what they would like to see happen in some of these spaces along the river, what they would imagine there. And this is one of the quotes from the students, translated here. Nature and animals are most important to us because we care about our planet and the animals that live on it. I think I have a video here too of one of these kids. This is pretty funny.
Shouldn't be in the future. If they don't want parks, they don't want a huge historic parks.
So when you say urbanization, you mean
like more buildings and space for walking, more liability of cars.
Okay, thank you. Okay, did you hear anything? What he was saying there? Their poster that they created was actually a satire, because they actually created a visual depiction of what they don't want to see happen, but they did it in a satirical way, saying, we should build a big shopping mall and a big parking lot and and then he said to me, he said, this is we're going to make it look like America, right? With a shopping mall and parking, all these places for cars. And I said, I'm from America. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry. He's like, I was stereotyping, I'm sorry. I'm like, no, actually, you're kind of right about it. And you should take note of what America has done and maybe not do some of those things, right? So he had this idea about urbanization, leading to all these results in terms of the natural environment. And so what came out of this is the proposal map. So you have this visioning map, these series of maps that were done with KTU and Shanxi residents. And now they're in the middle of this visioning map where people are putting down not just the places that they currently consider to be valuable to them, but what they would like to see happen in different places in the community, right? So again, it's just an example of kind of this the stickiness of a project, how one thing leads to another thing, and there are all these particularities that emerge over time as you become involved. I mean, even just in the 4 months that I've been here involved, this is a place that some people might look at and go, what is that? It's just mud and a couple of trees, flooded, right, next to the riverbank. And this person has written, it's very important to preserve the natural environment. This could be a little garden with colorful flowers and trees near the river, a calm place that people can enjoy, right? So I went and put in one of my ideas, because I spent a lot of time on the staircases here in Kaunas. There are many staircases all up and down through the neighborhoods, especially here in Jalakanis, but also in Shanxi. And I said, why don't they paint some of these staircases? It would be really fun, because they're they're all different, you know? And if you had colors, and every neighborhood could do their own version of how they wanted their staircases to look. So I was able to put this on the map and say, this is a hidden staircase in Shanxi. And this is an example from Los Angeles of a painted staircase, which is one of the most popular destinations for people taking selfie photos in Los Angeles. Can you believe that? We have much better and more impressive staircases in Conus than this one, right? So I said, well, you know, that's an idea. You know, why people could do that, right? So this is returning now to those concepts of collective efficacy and collective effervescence, moving towards kind of a conclusion here. So collective efficacy has to do with the ability of a group to actually engage in collective action to achieve a shared goal, right? And there's been a lot of studies in the United States about communities that have collective efficacy versus those that don't, and trying to look for the variables that lead to more collective efficacy versus less. Collective effervescence is a very sort of different, a concept with a very different type of a heritage to it. It goes back to Emil Durkheim's study of the sociology of religion, where Durkheim talked about how people especially engage in religious practice and ritual. The ritual is really just a way of getting to this state of collective effervescence, which has to do with kind of a loss of individuality, this submersion in a group process that brings about a kind of an ecstatic state, right? That enable that kind of an energy. And so what I started talking about with my friends here in Shanxi was this kind of connection through this whole process in Shanxi of the beginning with the start of the Cabbage Field project, and then this resistance to the road, and then the development of the opera, and then what's coming out of that, which is this vision for what Shanxi should be, and how these different stages in this process kind of fed each other. So you have these moments of collective effervescence when people are engaged in activity together, whether they're cleaning up a lot and doing an activity, a cultural activity, whether they're protesting together, or whether they're engaged in this community opera. This is from the performance in Rotterdam, which took place at the beginning of April. This brings about a kind of a sense of rejuvenation and excitement, which then contributes to the other more boring, mundane stuff, which is the stuff of collective efficacy, going to the community meetings. You saw in those pictures, people in the meetings taking the notes, asking the questions. People have to show up for community work. So in a sense, we started talking about how this collective effervescence, which Durkheim described as how communal gatherings intensify, electrify, and enlarge religious experience, how this bringing people together in close physical proximity, and I think that's very important because when we're talking about spaces where people are together, right, generates a kind of electricity that quickly transports them to an extraordinary degree of exaltation. And of course, this is collective efficacy. It's a much more kind of mundane definition. Perception of a group that they can successfully work together to accomplish their goals. So, as thinking about all these things I've learned here in Conus and Shanxi, and thinking about our project in Detroit, another project I'm involved with, which is this alley activation project. And I've talked about this a few times here, so I'm not going to talk about it too much detail because I'll be doing another talk about it next week. So I've talked a lot about alley activation, but alley activation really has to do with this process of turning an alley that looks like this, again, a neglected sort of overgrown space, into a communal space that's still green and inviting, but is also becomes a place where collective social activity can take place. I've been involved with this group called the Neighborhood Association. There are a number of different community groups in Detroit that have been working on these projects to clean and activate their alleys. And this is the language that the Neighborhood Association uses. They take their alley, which is this neglected space, they turn it into a greenway, and then they turn it into a dreamway. So I know I'm at time here, so I just want to leave you with a little bit of collective effervescence. Thinking about this process as a process of co-creation. So these are all some of the things that we've done as a part of this alley activation project. And you can also see how, it's also this combination of collective efficacy and collective effervescence. So I'm just going to leave you with some words from Chuck Rivers, who's the head of the Neighborhood Association.
The idea behind the alleys, in fact, is that at one time you could not actually walk through these alleys. Our alleys were basically impassable. And we asked ourselves, what do we have in common as neighbors? What do we have in common? And so he was over here on our drive, these people over here on Snow. Well, what do they have in common with him? Yeah. So now let's work on the stuff that we have in common. So we have our alleys in common. Initially we had 6 alleys, now we have 18 alleys. And so the idea is to make our alleys walkable, to make them safe, to make them enjoyable. And so that's why you see basically the green. We've taken on the phrase that we've created ourselves of making our alleyways, greenways, and going from those greenways that we have to dream ways. What do we dream that we'd like to see these alleys look like?
Okay, so again,
The idea behind the alleys, in fact, is that
we see another kind of example of how, one thing leads to another thing, and then these are some of the notes from our meeting yesterday where we talked about these different case studies here in CONUS. And I wanted to, I'll just put this up to conclude. I think this is another metaphor, analogy that came out of these meetings yesterday that we had here with our CONUS partners and other faculty and students. And one of our partners from Shanxi talked about the difference between the mushroom and the oak. I thought, well, this is like the most Lithuanian metaphor you could ever have, a mushroom and an oak tree, right? And he said, well, a lot of the activities that we engage in as a community are really more like mushrooms. They just kind of sprout up. And they might be there for like a week or a month and then they're gone, or even a few days. There's a lot of stuff that's just spontaneous that happens. And we don't know if how much of what we're doing is going to contribute to an oak tree. So we may be doing mushroom work versus building an oak tree, right? Think about this in sociology terms. It's like agency and structure in a sense, right? But then I said, well, have you thought about the connection between mushrooms and oak trees? Because ecology teaches us that actually in forests, these organisms exist in a complex symbiosis, right? So that what the mushrooms do underneath the surface in terms of decomposing the material and the network of the mycelium actually connects the trees together, serves as part of this communication system that enables the forest to grow, right? And respond to different challenges that it faces. So maybe there's a sense in which all this sort of mushroom activity, even this sort of micro bits of collective effervescence, right, are contributing to this longer term project, right? Which is this project of community building. Which is a process of growing an oak tree. And so I was going to conclude there, from our alley to yours. This is some of our colleagues in Detroit, and this is our rendition from Carnaby with a couple that's edited from Shanxi.
Don't put out the devils, don't put leadership grantu. Mičigano socialines kūno savame mieste.
And that's actually a song about Shanxi, from the katedra. So I wanted to leave with the idea that the forest, if you think about the oak tree as a community, the forest is this thing called civil society that I mentioned earlier, right? And the long-term project is this fostering of this vibrant civil society. But getting involved in these micro projects, I encourage you to take chances to cross borders, to learn what you can, to follow some of those threads and streams, because you never know what it will end up leading to and what will emerge in the end. So I thank you, and I leave you with that. Have a great day.